AB 1060. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
We don't have a position on this bill at this time, but we would note that it results in increased staffing and administrative costs for the California Health and Human Services Agency or the agency selected by the California Health and Human Services Agency to administer the Cancer Clinical Trials Foundation, because the first year of the foundation's existence will require extensive fundraising efforts by the board. The startup costs are estimated at $510,000 in 16-17 and $150,000 in 17-18. These costs are attributed to one-time legal services needed to establish the foundation, apply for nonprofit status, and promulgate regulations. Ongoing costs to administer the grant program are estimated to be $500,000. To the extent that sufficient funding is not achievable, the Cancer Clinical Trials Fund, this bill may create general fund cost pressure to continue the foundation.
Thank you. Questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to Assemblyman Bonta's items. His issues we'll deal with later. AB 176. Witnesses in support.
Mr. Chair, members, Adrian Lopez on behalf of the University of California in support.
Thank you. Additional witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
No file.
No file. With questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. AB 187. Witnesses in support.
Bernadette Ariano on behalf of the California Children's Hospital Association in support.
Thank you. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
We don't have a position on this bill, but we're concerned with the length of the carve-out extension that the bill presents for counties that don't have a county-organized health system plan. The continued use of carve-outs for certain services may limit the ability of Medi-Cal managed care delivery system to coordinate care, and it also contributes to fragmented service delivery, increased costs, and worse health conditions.
Thank you. Questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 266. Witnesses in support. The dynamic duo.
Good afternoon. John Lovell with the California Police Chiefs Association. We were the original sponsors of Assembly Bill 266 when it was authored by Mr. Cooley. When the bills were combined when the bill was combined with AB 34, we continue to support and be an active stakeholder with the bill. We support the bill at this time pending resolution of some very critically important local control issues, which at this point are still in abeyance.
Additional witnesses in support.
Karen Liggett again, and I am in strong support of this bill, and I've gotten a whole lot more people involved with this bill, and they are very much for it. And again, save another Peyton.
Thank you. Additional witnesses in support.
Angela Haywood on behalf of the NAACP in support.
Thank you. Witnesses in opposition. Please come forward.
Thank you. Michael Green, Fresno Cannabis Association. We've expressed our opposition to this bill. Local control is a continuing issue with this, and a news headline last week kind of brought this to the forebear. There was a story about at least alleged improper union dealings in the city of Oakland. Our people have expressed their own concerns with the city of Los Angeles, the exemption of the city of Los Angeles, and some of the union practices there that may or may not pass muster. In terms of the Fresno area, where you have total dispensary bans, total bans on cultivation, excessive fines at the local level, you're creating a system of state regulation that allows local governments to immediately opt out. And so the question of revenues springs to mind. How are you going to pay for this new state agency, knowing that the only possible funding mechanisms come from Humboldt County growers or dispensaries in LA, and the great majority of the state is left out in the cold. So we certainly think on the funding mechanisms, this bill needs some more work. We do appreciate all the hard work that the co-authors have put into it. but we would like them to perhaps vet some of the issues that came up in the last week, and we would like them to address local control head-on. Cannabis regulation is a matter of statewide concern. Thank you.
Thank you. Additional witnesses in opposition. Finance.
No file.
No file. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 366. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
The Department of Finance is opposed to this bill. We think it's unnecessary, and it does result in new general fund costs not included in the 2015 budget. The department is currently required to monitor access to necessary medical care in its fee-for-service delivery system as a condition of federal approval of the provider rate reductions implemented in 2011. When the department identifies an access problem for specific Medi-Cal benefits, AB 97 authorized the director to exempt a provider category from the reductions, and several provider categories have been exempted under this authority. So this bill would likely require 2 new positions and $250,000, $125,000 of which is general fund, for the department to collect data and prepare the report with a level of detail required.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we move this item to the suspense file. Last Bonta issue, item AB 1305. Witnesses in support.
Seth Bramble here on behalf of the California Teachers Association in support.
Thank you. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
No file.
No file. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we move this item to the suspense file. We have Assemblymember Daly with us. Welcome. We've been expecting you. You have 2 items. You are waiving presentation on AB 932, correct?
Correct.
Perfect. So let's start with the bill that has a due pass recommendation. That's AB 999.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. This bill allows landlords to dispose of abandoned mobile homes fairly and equitably. Abandoned mobile homes often have little to no value, and all too frequently the owners of such properties owe back taxes. My bill fixes this problem by ensuring that the delinquent taxpayer remains responsible for the unpaid property taxes. With me today is Catherine Borg, representing the Western Manufactured Housing Communities Association, the sponsor of the bill.
Ms. Borg.
Catherine Borg from the Western Manufactured Housing Communities. We're the sponsor, and we ask for your support today. Thank you.
Thank you. Additional witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance is neutral on this bill. The bill establishes a new fee not to exceed $45 to be paid by mobile home park management to HCD in order to cover the cost to process the notice of disposal and gather any information required for completing the disposal process. We estimate that there will be an increase of requests for salvage permits, but that the fee will cover the costs entirely.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, Mr. Daly, would you like to close?
I respectfully request an aye vote.
Thank you. There's a motion by Senator Hill. Secretary, please call the roll.
The motion is due pass to the Senate floor. Laura?
Aye.
Laura, aye. Bates? Bell? Hill? Hill, aye. Leyva? Leyva, aye. Mendoza? Nielsen?
Thank you, Mr. Daly. We're going to hold this item open to allow absent members to add
Thanks
on.
again.
Thank you. Trucking right along on the agenda. We are moving to Assemblywoman Campos' bills, beginning with AB 80. Witnesses in support.
Seth Bramble here on behalf of the California Teachers Association in support.
Thank you.
Angela Haywood on behalf of the NAACP in support.
Sean Reagan, Fresno ELC in support.
Sally Espinoza on behalf of Attorney General Kamala D. Harris in support.
Thank you. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
No file.
No file. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we move this item to the suspense file. AB 375. Witnesses in support.
Seth Bramble here on behalf of the California Teachers Association in support.
Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
We don't have a position on this bill. We note that it would likely result in an increase to the existing differential pay mandate program by tens of thousands of dollars of Prop 98 general fund to reimburse LEAs for administrative costs related to the new benefit. Prior to the creation of the mandate's block grant, statewide cost claims for administration of the existing program ranged in the thousands of dollars annually. If administration costs for this new differential pay benefit were similar to the costs previously existing in the program, it would likely result in annual costs of between $10,000 and $50,000, Prop 98 General Fund. The changes proposed by the bill are not anticipated to result in state reimbursement of local costs for differential pay, the amount of the employee's salary remaining after covering the cost of a substitute teacher. Previously, the Commission on State Mandates found that for the existing program, an increase in benefits or compensation for a particular group of public employees did not result in an increased level of service.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 561, witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
The Agricultural Labor Relations Board has indicated that it will need up to $2.8 million general fund for 11 positions to prepare monetary award calculations for compliance hearings and to process compliance decisions within a year. They give a breakout of positions here, mostly because these cases are difficult to predict and likely would require a lot of work, that they would be particularly complicated. The Department of Finance notes that any request for additional resources would be evaluated during the budgetary process.
Thank you. Questions or comments from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to Assemblywoman Cristina Garcia's items, beginning with AB 82. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
We're opposed to this bill because the DMV currently provides data to Selective Service 2 times a year, and it's unclear that this process is insufficient as exists currently. DMV is noting implementation and first-year costs currently estimated to be $435,000. There's no indication that any additional federal funding is available for this purpose.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 302, witnesses in support.
Seth Bramble here on behalf of the California Teachers Association. Strong support.
Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because it would likely create a state reimbursable mandate of tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars of Prop 98 General Fund by requiring school districts to provide reasonable accommodations for lactating pupils and to respond to and address pupil complaints. The bill would cost $147,000 General Fund, non-Prop 98, and require 1.5 positions for the Department of Education to process appeals, increase monitoring and technical assistance efforts, and support other administrative functions, such as updating policies, procedures, and regulations. We would also note that current law establishes prohibitions against discrimination, including discrimination against pregnant and parenting pupils.
Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to suspense file. Moving on to AB 609, witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance is neutral on this bill, which promotes accountability and transparency in the member of legislature candidacy process. The Secretary of State indicates that the cost to implement the bill would be minor and absorbable.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 1117, witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because it's unnecessary and would add significant general fund costs that are not included in the current budget. The bill results in additional staffing and contracting costs of approximately $400,000 to collect funds, develop and implement immunization improvement strategies for providers, implement the incentive payment system for immunization rates and other administrative activities. The bill authorizes that the expenses be funded from 33.3% of the voluntary contributions from Medi-Cal managed care plans. However, to the extent that these contributions are not sufficient to cover the costs, or if federal matching funds are not available, the costs end up borne by the general fund.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Members, the hour of 2 p.m. is upon us, which means we are going to convene our Senate floor session, so we will stand in recess until we adjourn our Senate session, and then we will reconvene our Appropriations Committee. Thank you.
Let's hope it doesn't get that far.
Thank you. We are going to convene as a subcommittee until we get our members back. And we have,
I don't think we have to reestablish as a quorum, do we? Because we were just in recess.
okay, yeah, quorum was previously established. So we will invite Assemblor Wood to come forward.
Thank you very much, Chair and members. Thank you for the opportunity to present AB 243 today. This bill, through an excise tax on medical marijuana cultivators, will provide resources to mitigate some of the negative effects of the cultivation of marijuana. It will protect the environment, provide additional resources to local law enforcement, and create a grant program for environmental cleanup of illegal cultivation sites. A Huffington Post article last year highlights findings from ArcView Group, which is a national investor group that provides financing to marijuana-based ventures, that said that the legal marijuana industry in California is valued at $1.3 billion, and the national legal cannabis industry valued closer to $3.3 billion. The industry, Emerald Growers Association, among others, believe that the number is actually very low and that the market in California could be as high as $32 billion. There are very few environmental regulations for medical cannabis cultivators. An estimated 60 to 70% of all marijuana consumed in the United States comes from 3 counties in my assembly district, commonly referred to as the Emerald Triangle. The challenges of conflict with state and federal law have led to a grossly unregulated industry. This has led to serious and somewhat dire environmental damage. The biggest problems we are facing are illegal water diversions, unpermitted ponds, unpermitted roads, the judicious use of fertilizers, pesticides, and rodenticides. This is having devastating effects on our watersheds in the face of an already catastrophic drought. In an effort to protect the environment, the State Water Resources Control Board and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife requested funding from the governor to create a task force to address the natural resource damage from marijuana cultivation. And last year, the governor responded by approving a $1.8 million project in Northern California called the Watershed Enforcement Team. The program is funded again in 2015 and 16. AB 243 would make this program a permanent statewide program. The bill also requires all 9 regional water quality control boards in the state to develop environmental protection guidelines to address wastewater discharges from medical marijuana farms. The first of these was adopted by the North Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board last week. Regulations can only do so much with limited resources and funding. AB 243 provides funding for additional resources by establishing a cannabis excise tax based on the weight. We have received technical support from the BOE, and we do now have a tax rate that would generate about $60 million of new revenue for the state. The funds collected would be dispersed in the following way: 10% for administration of the program, 30% to local law enforcement, 30% to fund the Watershed Enforcement Team, or the WET program, and 30% to fund a competitive grant program for environmental cleanup and restoration, or the restoration of public and private lands that have been damaged from illegal marijuana cultivation. Local law enforcement, local governments, and the environment would finally receive some relief in the form of the proposed excise tax in AB 243 that is long overdue. I would also like to add that the proposed excise tax to fund law enforcement and cleanup of the environment is a bipartisan issue. Some of you may have received a letter from George Runner, who recently stating his support in general for a cannabis excise tax. So in closing, I would just like to thank you. I know where this bill is going, and I appreciate the opportunity to present to you here today.
Thank you. Thank you. I do appreciate your work in this area. As somebody who recently visited your district.
Yes, you did.
Got to speak with the law enforcement firsthand on the issues that are going on up north are very, very real. So I appreciate you working on this issue. Witnesses in support.
Briefly, Briefly, thank you, Chair and members, for the opportunity to speak today. Hezekiah Allen on behalf of the Emerald Growers Association, continuing with our strong support for the Assembly members' effort. The regulated community wants this regulation and tax program just as much as anybody else. We need to solve this crisis. AB 243 is a great step in that direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Charles Watson on behalf of California Trout in support. Thank you.
Christian Molina from the Sierra Club, California in support.
Thank you. Additional witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition, please come forward.
Thank you. Fresno Cannabis Association, my name is Michael Green. We would like to thank Assemblymember Wood for his leadership on this. There's a lot of work to be done as far as taxation issues. Obviously, there are a couple of other comprehensive bills in play, SB 643 and AB 266. We strongly support the watershed enforcement team. We do acknowledge there are serious problems, not just in the Emerald Triangle, but also in places like Fresno, where you don't have the ability to capture any of the tax revenue. And of course, even if we have environmental enforcement funds, there's some question about whether those permitted grows in the Emerald Triangle will end up kind of subsidizing enforcement in places like Fresno, where you aren't capturing any tax revenues. So we would certainly support any continued funding going forward for the pilot program on the watershed enforcement team. Certainly there is a great need in the Emerald Triangle. However, we do believe there are some serious questions as far as the imposition of the excise tax, especially when so many other taxation issues are in play. And there are, of course, some mechanisms with the state water boards to collect their own fees, as the Santa Rosa people did on the North Coast. Central Valley Region will be next. Fish and Wildlife has the ability to capture their own fees and fines as well. So we would appreciate some additional work on this, hopefully some collaboration with the authors of the other bills, but we certainly do support the watershed enforcement team and the goals of this bill. Thank you.
Additional witnesses in opposition. Finance.
No file.
No file on the item. Any comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, Mr. Wood, would you like to close?
I would just like to say thank you once again for the opportunity to testify. I have been working closely with the authors of 266 and SB 643. There are no tax mechanisms in either of those bills right now. There is a potential framework for that, but there is nothing there. They're well aware of my efforts. This is a taxation on cultivation at the cultivation level for the farmers themselves. It is unique, I believe, and it is resources to go to where it's sorely needed the most. It would also potentially affect indoor cultivation as well. So this is not necessarily exclusive to outdoor cultivation. So I thank you very much for your indulgence.
Thank you. Without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to continue to work the file, members. If we get our quorum back, we want to be able to dispense with the items that we currently have on call to allow members to attend other meetings. We're going to continue with Assemblymember Gomez's items on the agenda, starting with AB 88. Witnesses in support, witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because it will result in state and local revenue losses of $4.5 million annually. In general, California sellers, including nonprofit organizations, fire departments, charities, and volunteer organizations, must pay sales tax on their taxable sales. It's not clear that for-profit companies selling energy or water-efficient home appliances under the specified conditions of this bill should receive preferential treatment by way of a tax exemption, while other worthy entities do not receive such a tax exemption for their sales.
Thank you. Are you in opposition or in support?
Support. Sierra Club, California, support.
Thank you. Let's be a little quicker. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we move this item to a suspense file. Moving on to AB 668, witnesses in support, witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because it may reduce property tax revenues by a potentially significant extent by changing the valuation methodology for property purchased from nonprofit organizations that specialize in the provision of affordable housing. Any property tax revenues lost by K-14 schools are generally needing to be backfilled by the state on a dollar-for-dollar basis because of the Prop 98 school funding mechanism. Additionally, costs incurred by county assessors to comply with this bill's provisions may be deemed a reimbursable mandate.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 1205, witnesses in support.
Charles Watson on behalf of the California Association of Local Conservation Corps, Audubon, California, and California Trout in strong support. Thank you.
Thank you. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Although promoting greenhouse gas emission reduction and carbon sequestration while achieving multiple co-benefits through river restoration and related projects is laudable, we have to oppose this bill for a couple of reasons. First, it creates significant cost pressures to the greenhouse gas reduction funds that are already allocated to transportation, resource conservation, forestry, and sustainable agriculture programs. Additionally, the projects identified by this bill may not provide significant net greenhouse gas emission reductions, making them a questionable investment of greenhouse gas reduction funds, and will require extensive resources for the Air Resource Board to develop quantification methods. The Air Resources Board has indicated that it would need $666,000 GGRF and 4 positions in the first year and $525,000 ongoing with 3 positions. The board's estimated cost may increase if the grant program is larger than $20 million.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 1230, witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance opposes this bill because it will continuously appropriate significant additional general fund resources that are inconsistent with the current budget. This bill transfers $50 million from the general fund to the California Americans with Disabilities Act Small Business Compliance Financing Authority for the purposes of funding loan loss reserve accounts and administering the program. The fund will be continuously appropriated, which limits the legislature's and the administration's ability to modify the state's expenditure plan if and when deemed necessary, which is especially problematic in a challenging fiscal climate.
Comments from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to suspense file. Last Senator Gomez item is AB 1391, witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because it could create a reimbursable state mandate costing likely tens of thousands of dollars of Proposition 98 general fund by requiring schools to adopt specific complaint procedures relating to violations of instructional minute requirements for PE. It also creates non-Proposition general fund non-Proposition 98 general fund costs for the Department of Ed to support the increased requirements of the bill.
Thank you. Comments from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to suspense file. Moving on to Assembly Member Bigelow, AB 142. Witnesses in support. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman and members, good afternoon. Mark Thiessen with the Gualco Group on behalf of the Amador Water Agency, the sponsor of this legislation. The Resources Agency has projected a one-time general fund cost of $250,000 for the study called for in this legislation. Because of the importance of this study, importance in terms of it will provide the legislature with fact-based, peer-reviewed science and a recommendation as to whether a portion of the McCullough River that's designated in the legislation is suitable or not suitable for inclusion in the comprehensive and extensive protections of the California Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. My point here, and the fiscal point is, the stakeholders, the local government entities have since May discussed and decided to step up and contribute to the funding of this study. We've made that offer to the author. We've been in conversations with staff on both sides of the aisle, and the stakeholders are willing, able, and ready to enter into a cost-sharing agreement, ready in terms of they've already taken it to their boards and made significant pledges of financial contributions. So we ask you to consider that when this bill is pending on suspense. Thank you.
Thank you. Additional witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because it creates a new general fund cost not included in the administration's current fiscal plan, and I'm referencing the $250,000 study. We are unaware of offers or secured private funding, but would obviously revisit our position if that were to happen.
Thank you. Questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to suspense file.